The palace world of sovereignty glittered like a polished jewel against the darkness of space, its silver towers reflecting the light of three distant suns. From orbit, it looked peaceful, elegant, and far too expensive to explode. Adrian Cole appreciated that last detail more than most people. After several years as a battlefield medic during the Orion border conflicts, he had developed a simple philosophy about buildings. If they were not currently on fire, collapsing, or being shot at by orbital artillery, they were already excellent places to work. The Grand Hall of Sovereignty Palace was not on fire. It was also not collapsing. That alone made Adrian unusually optimistic about the evening. Unfortunately, it was filled with diplomats. Hundreds of representatives from dozens of alien civilizations gathered around a table that stretched across the chamber like a metallic river. Soft starlight filtered through the transparent dome above, and holographic constellations drifted slowly through the air. Floating music drones hummed gentle melodies while servers carried plates that smelled either wonderful or suspicious, depending on how much experience one had with interstellar poisoning. Adrian stood quietly beside the royal table, wearing the simple dark uniform of a palace food taster. It was not an impressive position, at least not in appearance. No armor, no medals, no dramatic entrance music. Just a spoon, a scanner, and the uncomfortable responsibility of eating potentially dangerous food before the Queen did. Across the table sat Queen Helena of Sovereignty. To someone unfamiliar with her species, she looked almost completely human. Her posture was calm and elegant, her expression thoughtful, her dark hair braided beneath a crown shaped like delicate starfire. Only one feature revealed the truth. Her ears were long and graceful, tapering slightly like the carved wings of an ancient statue. Those ears were currently angled toward two arguing ambassadors. "This trade agreement is clearly unfair," one of them insisted loudly. "It is mathematically generous," replied the other. Adrian did not follow the politics very closely. He had learned long ago that diplomacy was simply warfare conducted with paperwork instead of explosions. Personally, he preferred the explosions. At least they were honest. A server approached with the first course of the evening. The plate floated gently down onto the table, guided by a hovering tray drone that beeped proudly as if it had personally invented soup. Adrian stepped forward. Protocol required that he test every dish before the Queen touched it. The scanner on his wrist emitted a quiet pulse, analyzing chemical compounds. After that came the less glamorous step, the tasting. He lifted the spoon, studied the steaming liquid, and sighed softly. "Please tell me that's not glowing again," he muttered. The soup shimmered faintly with a soft blue light. Adrian tasted it anyway. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he nodded. "Well, it's not poison," he announced calmly. Queen Helena glanced toward him with mild amusement. "That is a comforting review." "It also tastes like someone boiled a flashlight," Adrian added. A few nearby diplomats tried very hard not to laugh. The next course arrived soon after. Thin slices of crystal fruit arranged in geometric patterns. Adrian tested them carefully. Safe. The third dish involved something that looked suspiciously alive. Adrian poked it with a fork. It poked back. He glanced toward the royal chef. "Is it supposed to do that?" "Yes," the chef replied proudly. Adrian tasted it anyway. "All right," he admitted after a moment. "Not bad." Queen Helena watched the exchange with quiet interest. She had observed Adrian many times during these events. Unlike most palace staff, he behaved with relaxed confidence instead of nervous ceremony. It was almost as if he had already survived situations far worse than an awkward diplomatic dinner, which of course he had. Another dish arrived, then another. Each one passed Adrian's inspection. The music drifted softly across the hall. Conversations flowed easily between ambassadors. The enormous, starlit ceiling made the entire gathering feel less like a political meeting and more like an expensive dream. Adrian allowed himself to relax slightly. Tonight, he thought, might actually be peaceful. Then the main course arrived. The plate placed before Queen Helena carried silver-leaf fish surrounded by a delicate violet sauce. The aroma spread slowly through the air, rich and complex. Adrian leaned forward automatically. Something about the smell stopped him. It was faint, almost invisible beneath the spices. Most people would never notice. But Adrian Cole had spent years inside crowded medical tents during wartime, surrounded by chemical burns, leaking bioweapons, and medkits that smelled like synthetic antiseptic. His brain recognized the scent instantly. A tiny alarm rang inside his thoughts. His eyes narrowed, the Queen lifted her fork, and Adrian's instincts moved before his diplomacy could catch up. Adrian's hand moved forward almost on its own, a reflex carved into his nerves during years of emergency medicine and situations where hesitation usually resulted in funerals. His fingers closed gently around Queen Helena's wrist just as the fork rose toward her mouth. For a moment, the entire universe appeared to pause. Helena's fork stopped midair. The floating music drones continued humming politely, unaware they were now providing the soundtrack to what might become the most awkward diplomatic incident in galactic history. Several ambassadors froze with drinks halfway to their mouths. A security officer on the far side of the hall immediately reached for his weapon before realizing that the assassin currently holding the Queen's wrist was the man whose official job description involved eating soup first. Adrien realized what he had just done. He was holding the Queen's hand during a state banquet in front of several hundred witnesses. His brain politely informed him that palace etiquette probably had an entire chapter titled, "Please do not grab the monarch." Queen Helena turned her head slowly and looked at him. Her expression was calm, curious, and very awake. Her long ears tilted slightly forward. Adrien swallowed. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "I would strongly recommend that the next bite of that dish be postponed." Around them, the diplomats began whispering. One of the nearby senators leaned toward another and murmured, "Is this part of the ceremony?" "I believe it's either that," the other replied quietly, "or a very creative assassination attempt." Helena lowered the fork without pulling her hand away from Adrian's grip. Instead, she studied his face with the sharp attention of someone used to reading intentions faster than most people read documents. "Is something wrong with the food?" she asked. Adrien leaned closer to the plate again, inhaling slowly. There it was. The scent was subtle, masked by herbs and alien spices, but unmistakable. He had smelled it once before, inside a battlefield triage tent. Half a squadron of soldiers had collapsed within minutes of exposure. The memory arrived instantly and unpleasantly. He straightened. "Yes," Adrien said quietly. Now the surrounding guards had moved closer, their armor reflecting the pale light of the chamber. The captain of the royal guard looked deeply confused about whether he should arrest Adrien, salute him, or ask him to taste the fish first. Helena tilted her head slightly. "What kind of wrong?" she asked. Adrien released her wrist slowly, though he kept himself positioned between the plate and the Queen. "The kind that stops hearts," he replied. The whispers around the table turned into a low wave of alarm. One ambassador dropped his glass. Another attempted to hide under the table with surprising speed. A third loudly insisted that he had always distrusted fish. Helena, however, remained completely calm. She glanced down at the dish again. "Poison?" Adrien nodded once. "I'm about 90% certain." 90%? "I prefer honesty," Adrien said. "Also, 10% of the time my instincts are wrong, and the chef simply used very strange seasoning." The royal chef, standing across the hall, suddenly looked personally offended by this possibility. Helena studied the plate. Then she raised one eyebrow slightly. "Perhaps we should confirm before declaring a palace crisis." The captain of the guard immediately signaled two security technicians forward. They approached carrying portable scanning devices that unfolded like metallic flowers. The instruments hovered above the dish and began humming softly as they analyzed its chemical structure. The seconds stretched uncomfortably. Adrien crossed his arms. One diplomat whispered loudly, "If it is poison, does that mean we all go home early?" Another diplomat whispered back, "You only say that because you already finished dessert." The scanners emitted a sharp tone. One of the technicians looked up. His face had gone pale. "Captain," he said quietly, "the sauce contains a synthetic neurotoxin." The words rippled through the hall like a shockwave. Someone gasped. Several people stood up at once. The royal guards immediately sealed the chamber doors, while additional scanners activated across the table. Servers froze in place, suddenly very aware that they were holding trays potentially connected to an assassination attempt. The captain turned toward Adrien slowly. You identified this by smell? Adrian shrugged slightly. It's a hobby. Helena looked at the plate again. Then she looked at Adrian. A slow smile formed on her face. You stopped my hand, she said thoughtfully. Yes, Your Majesty. You were willing to cause a diplomatic scandal in front of half the galaxy. Adrian considered that. In my defense, he said carefully, a scandal is easier to survive than neurotoxin. For a moment, Helena simply stared at him. Then she laughed, not a polite royal chuckle, a real laugh. The tension in the hall cracked instantly as several diplomats exhaled in relief. Helena stood up from her chair. Before Adrian could process what she was doing, she stepped closer, placed one hand lightly on his shoulder, and kissed him on the cheek. The entire room went silent again. Adrian's brain stopped working. Helena stepped back with a warm smile. You just saved my life, she said calmly. Adrian blinked. Yes, Your Majesty. A nearby ambassador whispered loudly to another. Is this also part of the ceremony? The other ambassador nodded very seriously. I believe it is called the heroic soup protocol. For several seconds after the Queen kissed his cheek, Adrian Cole stood completely still. Not politely still, not professionally still, completely, absolutely frozen. His brain, which had successfully identified battlefield toxins, emergency surgeries, and at least 3 different varieties of alien parasites, was now struggling to process the concept of a monarch thanking him with a public kiss in front of several hundred witnesses and approximately 12 active security drones. Around them, the diplomatic hall remained silent. A senator from the Vega coalition leaned toward a colleague and whispered, Did the Queen just kiss the soup man? I believe she did, the colleague whispered back. Is that normal? I have absolutely no idea. Queen Helena, meanwhile, appeared perfectly comfortable with the situation. She returned to her seat as if royal gratitude through unexpected cheek kissing was simply another item on the evening's agenda. Adrian slowly touched his cheek. He turned toward the nearest guard. Did that actually happen? The guard looked deeply conflicted about answering. I believe it did, sir. Adrian nodded slowly. Good. Just making sure I didn't accidentally inhale something strange from the fish. Across the table, the scanning technicians continued analyzing the poisoned dish, while several palace investigators arrived carrying portable forensic drones. The small machines floated over the table, projecting holographic chemical diagrams into the air. The violet sauce glowed under the scanners like a tiny, deadly galaxy. One of the investigators spoke quietly to the captain of the Royal Guard. It's a sophisticated compound, he said. Military grade, slow-acting, heart failure within 4 minutes. Another diplomat fainted. Helena calmly sipped water. 4 minutes, she repeated thoughtfully. She turned her head slightly toward Adrian. That seems inconvenient. Adrian folded his arms. I would describe it as extremely inconvenient. Several nearby ambassadors laughed nervously, grateful for the humor. The captain of the guard stepped forward. Your Majesty, we are initiating full containment protocols. No one leaves the hall until we identify how the toxin entered the kitchen. Helena nodded. Reasonable. Then she glanced around the enormous chamber filled with anxious dignitaries. Well, she added lightly, this dinner has certainly become more interesting. One ambassador raised a hand cautiously. Does this mean the dessert course is canceled? Adrian looked at him. You almost witnessed an assassination and your main concern is dessert? The ambassador hesitated. It is very good dessert. Helena laughed again. I admire the dedication. The investigation moved quickly. Kitchen staff were questioned. Food containers were scanned. Supply records appeared as floating holograms above the table, while security drones analyzed every ingredient used during the meal. Adrian remained near the Queen, partly because that was his job, and partly because the captain of the guard had politely suggested he should not wander off, while technically being the hero of the evening. One of the investigators approached him. You detected the toxin by smell? Adrian nodded. Years of medical training. The investigator looked skeptical. Our sensors barely detected it. Adrian shrugged. Your sensors didn't spend 3 years in field hospitals. The man considered that. Fair point. Queen Helena leaned slightly toward Adrian. You recognized it immediately. Not immediately, Adrian admitted. I thought it might just be unusual seasoning. And then my survival instincts started yelling at me. Helena tilted her head with curiosity. Do they often yell? Constantly, Adrian said. Usually about soup. Another ripple of laughter spread across the table. Despite the tension of the investigation, the atmosphere gradually softened. Diplomats began speaking again, guards relaxed slightly, and the music drones resumed their gentle melodies. After several minutes, the chief investigator returned. He projected a rotating molecular diagram above the table. The poison was introduced through the violet sauce concentrate, he explained. The container was tampered with before it arrived in the palace kitchens. Helena studied the hologram carefully. External sabotage. Most likely. The captain of the guard frowned. That means someone planned this long before tonight. Adrian leaned closer to the projection. Professional work, he said quietly. Not the kind of poison you buy in a back alley market. Helena looked at him again. You've seen it before. Adrian nodded slowly. During the Orion conflicts. Several diplomats looked uncomfortable at the mention of war. Helena's expression softened slightly. So your wartime experience saved my life tonight. Adrian rubbed the back of his neck. I suppose so. She leaned back in her chair, thoughtful. For years, my advisors told me that peace required fleets, armies, and armored guards. Her eyes moved toward Adrian. Apparently, it also requires a suspicious man with a spoon. Adrian blinked. I prefer the title Professional Soup Survivor. Helena smiled. Very well, Adrian Cole. She lifted her glass. To the most vigilant food taster in the galaxy. The diplomats hesitated for a moment. Then one by one, they raised their glasses as well. To the soup survivor, someone repeated. Adrian looked around the enormous hall filled with laughing ambassadors, scanning drones, and a queen who had just survived an assassination attempt. He sighed quietly. Well, he muttered, this is definitely going in my performance review. The banquet did not end immediately after the discovery of the poison. In fact, it became strangely more organized. Security officers moved through the hall with quiet efficiency, scanning plates, glasses, serving trays, and occasionally suspicious-looking bread rolls. Investigators questioned kitchen staff while hovering drones projected molecular diagrams into the air like floating puzzles of glowing light. Despite all of this, the music drones continued their soft performance, apparently programmed with the simple philosophy that diplomatic dinners should not stop simply because of minor assassination attempts. Adrian stood beside the Queen's chair while watching a security scanner examine a bowl of glowing fruit. You know, he muttered, in most jobs, the most dangerous part of dinner is overeating. Queen Helena heard him and smiled faintly. In this palace, she replied, dinner occasionally tries to kill you. That seems like an inefficient way to run a government. Helena glanced toward him. And yet tonight it failed. Adrian folded his arms. That's because your food taster has trust issues. The Queen laughed softly. Several nearby diplomats visibly relaxed at the sound. The tension that had filled the room earlier was slowly dissolving into cautious conversation and quiet curiosity. Across the hall, the chief investigator approached with a group of technicians. One of the floating forensic drones projected a complex holographic chain of supply shipments above the table. The poison entered through a sauce concentrate container, the investigator explained. The container seal was professionally replaced. Whoever did this knew exactly how palace supply inspections work. The captain of the Royal Guard frowned, meaning the assassin had detailed knowledge of our logistics. Or access to someone who does, the investigator replied. One ambassador leaned toward another. This dinner has become very educational, he whispered. Yes, the other agreed. I have learned to never trust purple sauce. Adrian stepped closer to the holographic projection. Can you trace the shipment route? The investigator nodded and adjusted the display. A glowing line appeared, stretching across several star systems. The shipment originated from a culinary supplier on the trade world of Carthus, he said. From there, it passed through 3 cargo ports before reaching sovereignty. Adrian studied the glowing route carefully. That's a lot of opportunities for sabotage. The investigator nodded. Exactly. Queen Helena rested one elbow on the table, watching the discussion thoughtfully. Her long ears angled slightly toward the speakers, catching every detail. "What concerns me," she said calmly, "is the timing." The investigator looked at her. "You believe the banquet itself was the target?" Helena nodded. "Hundreds of ambassadors, representatives from rival alliances. My death tonight would not simply remove a queen." She gestured toward the hall. "It would ignite half the galaxy." The diplomats nearby suddenly looked very uncomfortable. One of them cleared his throat nervously. "From a diplomatic perspective, that would indeed be inconvenient." Adrien tilted his head. "Inconvenient is one word for it." Another diplomat raised a cautious hand. "If war had started tonight," he asked carefully, "would dessert still have been served?" Adrien stared at him. "You're very committed to dessert." The man shrugged. "It was a very promising dessert." Helena shook her head with amused disbelief. "Ambassador, if war begins because of poisoned fish, dessert will be the least of your problems." "Still," the ambassador muttered quietly, "it would be a disappointing ending to the meal." The captain of the guard stepped forward again. "Your Majesty, we will expand the investigation immediately. Cargo records, staff backgrounds, supplier communications, everything." Helena nodded. "Good." She looked toward Adrien again. "And what do you think, Mr. Cole?" Adrien blinked slightly. "Me? Yes." He rubbed the back of his neck thoughtfully. "Well, whoever planned this understood two things." "And those are?" "First," Adrien said, "they knew the poison had to be subtle enough to pass multiple scanners." The investigator nodded slowly. "That is correct." "And second," Adrien continued, "they expected the queen to eat the dish before anyone noticed." Helena tilted her head. "And they were wrong." Adrien smiled slightly. "Very wrong." One of the investigators looked at him with curiosity. "You trusted your instincts enough to physically stop the queen in front of half the galaxy?" Adrien shrugged. "On battlefields you learn that hesitation is expensive." Helena watched him carefully. "You acted without worrying about the consequences." Adrien looked around the enormous hall filled with diplomats, security drones, and investigators. "I was worried," he admitted. "About what?" "About getting fired." For a moment, Helena simply stared at him. Then she laughed again, louder than before. Several ambassadors laughed with her. Even the captain of the guard allowed himself a small smile. Helena leaned slightly toward Adrien. "I assure you, Mr. Cole, saving the Queen's life is generally considered excellent job performance." Adrien nodded thoughtfully. "That's good to hear." "Why?" "Because grabbing the monarch during dinner seemed like a career risk." Helena raised an eyebrow playfully. "Perhaps." She paused. "Although the kiss may have complicated your performance evaluation." Adrien blinked. "I would prefer that not become a standard reward system." The Queen smiled. "Relax." She glanced around the hall once more. "I only kiss people who prevent my assassination." Adrien sighed with relief. "That's a very reasonable policy." The banquet eventually resumed, though it no longer resembled the elegant diplomatic evening it had been at the beginning. Security drones floated lazily above the tables, scanning every plate like suspicious metal birds. Palace guards stood along the walls pretending to look relaxed while very clearly not relaxing at all. Adrien remained beside Queen Helena's chair, arms folded, watching every new dish arrive as if the plates themselves might suddenly develop hostile intentions. One of the servers approached carefully with the next course. The poor man looked terrified. He placed the plate down slowly and stepped back as though it might explode. Adrien leaned forward and studied the food. The dish was a delicate arrangement of spiral vegetables and glowing amber grains that shimmered softly under the palace lights. He picked up his scanner. The device hummed quietly. Safe. He sniffed the food. Still safe. He tasted it. He chewed slowly while the entire nearby section of diplomats watched him like spectators at a sporting event. Finally, he nodded. "It will not kill anyone," Adrien announced. A small wave of relieved applause spread across the table. The server nearly fainted with gratitude. Queen Helena looked amused. "I believe you have developed a fan club." Adrien swallowed. "I would prefer a job where people are less excited about me surviving dinner." Across the hall, the investigation continued. Several holographic displays floated in the air, showing cargo routes, chemical formulas, and suspicious supplier records. Investigators moved through the room quietly questioning kitchen staff and transport officers. One of the royal analysts approached the Queen's table. "Your Majesty, we have traced the poisoned shipment to a transit port on the outer trade routes." Helena rested her chin lightly on her hand. "And the cargo container was briefly diverted through a private inspection facility." Adrian glanced up. "That sounds extremely legal." The analyst cleared his throat. "It was registered under a shell company." "Of course it was," Adrian muttered. Helena's long ears angled slightly forward. "Can you identify the individuals involved?" "We are still investigating," the analyst replied, "but the tampering required highly specialized biochemical equipment." Adrian leaned back in his chair slightly. "That poison wasn't cheap," the analyst nodded. "Correct." Helena studied the glowing holographic shipment routes drifting above the table. "Someone invested considerable resources into tonight's attempt." "Yes, Your Majesty." One nearby ambassador raised his hand cautiously. "Forgive my interruption," he said, "but if the assassin invested that much money, does that mean dinner is canceled?" Adrian stared at him. "You are still thinking about dinner?" The ambassador hesitated. "It is a very long banquet." Helena laughed quietly. "I admire your priorities." Another diplomat leaned closer to Adrian. "You tasted the poison before?" "Years ago," Adrian replied. "During the war?" Adrian nodded slowly. "It was used by a covert sabotage unit." The diplomat shivered. "That sounds unpleasant." Adrian shrugged. "Most poisoning attempts are." Helena glanced toward him again. "You speak about war very calmly." Adrian rubbed the back of his neck. "Field medics learn to stay calm. Panic makes surgery difficult." A nearby ambassador looked horrified. "You perform surgery during battles?" "Sometimes during explosions," Adrian said casually. The ambassador blinked several times. "I suddenly feel much better about eating glowing vegetables." Helena smiled faintly. "You see, Adrian, your experience is comforting." "That's a new description of battlefield trauma." At that moment, the chief investigator returned with another holographic report. The projection showed a rotating molecular model of the neurotoxin. "This compound was engineered to bypass standard palace scanners," the investigator explained. Helena studied the model carefully. "So the assassin expected our security systems to fail?" The investigator nodded. "Yes." Adrian leaned forward slightly. "They also expected something else." Everyone looked at him. "They expected no one to notice until the Queen collapsed." The room became quieter. Helena looked at him thoughtfully. "And instead they encountered you." Adrian shrugged. "Bad luck for them." One diplomat whispered to another. "Remind me never to poison anyone while that man is nearby." The other nodded quickly. "Agreed." Helena turned slightly toward Adrian. "You keep describing your actions as luck." "Mostly because I don't want to think about the alternative." "And what alternative is that?" Adrian looked around the enormous hall filled with diplomats, guards, investigators, and floating drones. "That I just accidentally ruined someone's very expensive assassination plan." Helena smiled. "I suspect you did." Across the hall, another security drone emitted a soft chime as it completed a scan of the banquet table. The music drones resumed their gentle melody. Diplomats slowly returned to their conversations. Dinner continued. Adrian picked up another spoon and studied the next arriving dish with deep suspicion. Helena noticed. "You still think the food might attack?" Adrian nodded seriously. "After tonight, I trust nothing that arrives on a plate." The Queen leaned slightly closer. "That is probably a wise policy." Adrian sighed quietly. "I miss battlefield rations." Helena blinked. "You miss military food?" "At least the military admitted it was dangerous." By the time the sixth course arrived, the banquet hall had settled into a strange balance between celebration and investigation. The diplomats had resumed their conversations, though every now and then someone glanced suspiciously at their plate before eating. The palace security teams were still working quietly, their drones floating above the hall like silent metallic fish, scanning everything from wine glasses to decorative centerpieces. Adrian stood near the Queen's chair again, examining a tray of small crystal pastries that shimmered with harmless-looking pink light. He leaned toward the server. "Does this one explode?" The server looked horrified. "I sincerely hope not." Adrian nodded. "Good. Just checking." Queen Helena watched him with clear amusement. "You are becoming very cautious." "I was always cautious," Adrian replied. "Tonight simply confirmed that dinner's a dangerous activity." Helena lifted one of the pastries and studied it. "And your professional opinion?" Adrian scanned it with his wrist device. The scanner chirped softly. He sniffed the pastry. Then he took a careful bite. The surrounding diplomats watched him again with intense concentration. Adrian chewed slowly. Then he raised one eyebrow. "It tastes like strawberries and poor decisions," he said. Helena laughed. "That is not a chemical classification." "It should be." Across the hall, the chief investigator continued working with the security team. Several holographic projections floated above the central table, showing cargo records and financial transfers connected to the poison shipment. The captain of the Royal Guard approached the Queen again. "Your Majesty, we've identified the inspection facility where the container was tampered with." Helena looked up. "And?" "It was abandoned 2 weeks ago." Adrian sighed. "That's always suspicious." The captain nodded grimly. "We are tracing the owners of the facility. The shell company appears connected to several political factions in the outer systems." One ambassador nearby whispered quietly to another. "That sounds complicated." The other ambassador nodded. "It usually means someone very rich tried to kill someone very important." Adrian pointed gently toward the Queen. "In this case, the someone important is sitting right there." The ambassadors immediately straightened their posture. Helena smiled faintly. "I appreciate the clarification." Another diplomat leaned forward nervously. "Your Majesty, may I ask a question?" Helena nodded. "Of course." The diplomat hesitated. "If the assassination had succeeded tonight, what would have happened?" The room became quieter again. Helena considered the question calmly. "Several alliances would accuse each other of involvement." She gestured lightly toward the gathered ambassadors. "Trade routes would close. Military fleets would mobilize. Old rivalries would awaken." She paused. "In other words, chaos." Adrian crossed his arms. "All triggered by one poisoned dinner." The diplomat swallowed nervously. "That seems fragile." Adrian nodded. "Galactic politics usually are." Helena glanced toward him. "You speak like someone who has seen systems collapse before." Adrian looked down at his empty pastry plate. "I've seen planets collapse before." The nearby diplomats fell silent again. After a moment, Helena gently shifted the tone. "Well," she said lightly, "fortunately tonight that future did not occur." Adrian nodded. "Because the fish smelled suspicious." A nearby ambassador chuckled nervously. "I will never look at fish the same way again." Another diplomat raised a glass. "To suspicious fish." Several others quietly repeated the toast. Helena smiled. The investigation drones continued drifting through the hall, while the banquet slowly moved toward its final courses. Adrian watched the activity thoughtfully. The chief investigator eventually returned to the table again, carrying a small metallic data core. "We have recovered surveillance records from the cargo port," he said. Helena leaned forward slightly. "And?" The investigator activated the device. A holographic image appeared above the table, showing a shadowy figure in a transport bay, working on the cargo container. The image was distorted, but the movement was clear. The person had professional tools, precise movements, efficient technique. Adrian studied the recording carefully. "That's not a random saboteur." The investigator nodded. "We believe the individual has military training." Helena's eyes narrowed slightly. "An assassin." "Most likely," one of the diplomats whispered nervously. "Do we know who hired them?" The investigator shook his head. "Not yet." Adrian leaned back in his chair. "Whoever it was invested a lot of effort." Helena turned toward him again. "And yet they failed." Adrian gave a small shrug. "That tends to happen when plans meet reality." Helena smiled at that. "You have a remarkable way of simplifying complex problems." "I spent years patching soldiers together under artillery fire," Adrian said. "You learn to appreciate simple outcomes." The Queen studied him quietly for a moment. "You stopped a galactic crisis tonight. Adrian shook his head slightly. I stopped a fork. Helena's smile widened. Sometimes that is the same thing. Across the hall, the musicians began playing a new melody as the final course approached. The atmosphere in the chamber was calmer now, though the investigation would clearly continue long after the banquet ended. Adrian glanced toward the next arriving tray. It carried small glowing cups of steaming tea. He sighed. Please tell me the tea is not politically unstable. The server looked exhausted. It is just tea. Adrian scanned it. Safe. He took a sip. He paused. Then he nodded slowly. All right, he said. This one only tastes dangerous. Helena laughed again, and for the first time since the poisoned fish appeared, the entire hall relaxed. The final course of the banquet arrived long after the initial panic had faded into cautious relief. The palace hall still glittered under the transparent dome, where distant stars drifted across the night sky. Diplomats had resumed their discussions, though many of them now inspected their plates with the focused suspicion of amateur detectives. Adrian Cole leaned against the edge of the royal table, watching a hovering tray deliver small bowls of golden dessert that glowed faintly like captured sunlight. He scanned one. The device beeped quietly. Safe. He tasted it. He chewed slowly. Around him, several ambassadors leaned forward in anticipation. Adrian nodded. No immediate death, he announced. The table relaxed again. Queen Helena raised an eyebrow. That is becoming your official culinary review. Adrian shrugged. It's an honest standard. Across the hall, the investigation team had reached its conclusion. The chief investigator approached once more, carrying a small holographic projector. Your Majesty, he said, activating the device. A series of images appeared in the air. Financial transfers, cargo logs, surveillance stills. The pieces of the puzzle finally connected. The sabotage was commissioned by a rival political faction operating from the frontier coalition of Virex, he explained. They hoped your death during this summit would collapse the Sovereignty Alliance and ignite conflict between the attending governments. Several ambassadors exchanged uneasy looks. Helena studied the projection calmly. And the assassin? Captured 2 hours ago, the investigator replied. Our agents traced the supply chain and intercepted them while they attempted to leave the system. Adrian nodded slowly. Efficient. The captain of the Royal Guard crossed his arms. The individual has already confessed under interrogation. One of the diplomats looked alarmed. That was fast. The captain shrugged slightly. The suspect realized very quickly that poisoning a queen during a televised diplomatic summit was not an excellent career decision. Helena leaned back in her chair thoughtfully. So the crisis ends tonight. Yes, Your Majesty. The holographic projections faded, leaving the hall bathed again in soft starlight and quiet music. For the first time since the poison dish appeared, the evening finally felt normal. Adrian looked down at the empty dessert bowl. Well, he said, that was an exciting dinner. Helena smiled faintly. You have a remarkable definition of exciting. Across the table, one of the ambassadors raised his glass. To survival. Another raised his glass as well. To the food taster. Within seconds, the entire table lifted their drinks. To Adrian. Adrian blinked. That seems excessive. Helena raised her own glass. Not at all. She looked at him directly. Tonight you prevented a war. Adrian shook his head. I prevented a fork. Helena tilted her head slightly. And yet that fork carried the future of several star systems. The diplomats murmured agreement. Adrian rubbed the back of his neck. Honestly, I just trusted my nose. One ambassador leaned forward curiously. You identified the poison that quickly? Adrian nodded. Old battlefield habits. The ambassador studied him with new respect. I used to think your job was ceremonial. Adrian smiled faintly. Most people do. Helena rested her hands calmly on the table. That will change. She looked toward the surrounding diplomats. The lesson tonight is simple. Everyone listened. The strongest shields in a civilization are not always fleets or armies. Her eyes shifted toward Adrian. Sometimes they are the quiet people who notice small dangers before anyone else. The hall fell silent for a moment. Then the music drones began playing again, a softer melody now. Adrian looked around the enormous chamber. The diplomats, the guards, the investigators, the floating lights drifting beneath the dome of stars. For years, he had been a medic on battlefields where survival lasted minutes at a time. Now he stood in the heart of a peaceful empire protecting something entirely different. Not soldiers, not wounded survivors, but stability. He exhaled slowly. Helena noticed. "You are thinking about something." Adrian nodded. "I spent years believing my skills only belonged in war. And now?" He gestured around the hall. "Apparently they also belong at dinner." Helena laughed softly. "That may be the most important battlefield of all." Adrian picked up the final cup of tea and took a sip. He nodded approvingly. "No poison." Helena raised an eyebrow. "High praise." Adrian set the cup down. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "for the first time in years, I feel like I'm actually helping keep people alive instead of just patching them up afterward." Helena looked pleased. "That is because tonight you stopped the disaster before it began." The diplomats began to rise as the banquet concluded, conversations filling the hall again. Adrian glanced toward the exit. "Well," he said, "I should probably go back to guarding the kitchen." Helena stood as well. "I think your responsibilities may have expanded." Adrian looked suspicious. "That sounds dangerous." She smiled. "Relax, Mr. Cole." She leaned slightly closer. "I will still let you taste the soup first." Adrian sighed. "That's all I ask." The palace lights dimmed slightly as the banquet ended, and the diplomats slowly departed beneath the stars. And Adrian Cole, former battlefield medic and accidental savior of a queen, remained exactly where he had started the evening, watching dinner very, very carefully.